Close your eyes for a moment and picture a Viking. Chances are, you're picturing a snarling giant of a man, wrapped in furs, a horned helmet jammed onto his head, an axe in one hand and a drinking horn full of mead in the other. Maybe he's standing on the prow of a dragon-headed ship, screaming into a storm. Maybe he's burning a monastery to the ground. Maybe he's got wild braided hair, wolf blue eyes, and the general demeanor of a man who has never once in his life used an indoor toilet. It's a good image. It's a cinematic image. It has sold 1,000 movies, 10,000 video games, and approximately every single metal album cover produced since 1978. It is also almost entirely wrong. The real Vikings were farmers. They were poets. They were some of the best groomed people in medieval Europe, obsessive about bathing, at a time when their supposedly more civilized neighbors to the south considered a once-a-year wash to be perfectly adequate. They were explorers who reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus was born, and traders who walked silk-lined markets in Baghdad. Their women could own property, initiate divorce, and in some cases, lead. Their legal system was so sophisticated that fragments of it still echo in English common law today. And not one single Viking, in the entire 250 years or so we call the Viking Age, ever wore a horned helmet into battle. Tonight, we're going to take the Viking apart, myth by myth, and put back together a picture that is, frankly, stranger and more interesting than the fiction. This isn't a story about horned helmets and blood-soaked longships, or at least, not only that. It's a story about ordinary people living in one of the harshest environments in Europe, who built ships that could cross oceans, laws that could hold together strangers, and a culture so influential that we are, whether we know it or not, still speaking their words, walking their trade routes, and living in towns they founded more than 1,000 years later. So get comfortable. This is a long one, and there's a lot of ground to cover a euro, from the fjords of Norway to the markets of Constantinople, from the courts of Iceland to the shores of Newfoundland. Let's begin, as most good stories about the Vikings do, with a mistake. A single, enormous, 900-year-old mistake sitting right on top of their heads. If there is one image more associated with the Vikings than any other, it's the horned helmet. It's on children's cartoons. It's on football team logos a euro, the Minnesota Vikings included. It's on Halloween costumes, beer branding, and the cover art of 1,000 fantasy novels that have nothing whatsoever to do with Scandinavia. It is, without question, the single most recognizable fact about Viking Age warriors. And it is completely made up. Not exaggerated. Not slightly wrong. Made up a euro invented in the 19th century by costume designers who had never seen a genuine Viking helmet, because at the time, nobody had ever found one that looked anything like that. Let's talk about what archaeologists have actually dug out of the ground. Across the entire Viking world a euro, and we're talking about a culture that spanned from Newfoundland to the Caspian Sea over roughly 250 years a euro, only one complete Viking Age helmet has ever been discovered. Just one. It was found in Norway, at a site called Germanbu, in a rich warrior's grave dating to around the 10th century. It's a rounded iron cap, with a spectacle-like guard over the eyes and nose, not unlike helmets worn by other cultures across contemporary Europe. It has no horns. It has no wings. It has nothing sticking out of it at all, because sticking things out of a piece of protective headgear is, if you stop and think about it for 2 seconds, an extraordinarily bad idea. Horns on a helmet aren't decorative flourishes in a vacuum a euro, they're handles. In hand-to-hand combat, with axes, swords, and spears at close range, a horn is something your enemy can grab, twist, and use to snap your neck or rip the helmet clean off your head, exposing your skull to the next blow. Actual historical horned helmets do exist, but they come from a much earlier period a euro, the Bronze Age, roughly 1,000 years before the Vikings a euro, and the evidence suggests those were ceremonial pieces, used in rituals, not warfare. There is no archaeological, artistic, or written evidence that Viking Age warriors wore horned helmets into battle. None. Not a single carving, not a single grave good, not a single contemporary account. So where did the myth come from? The answer is opera. Specifically, the answer is a 19th century German costume designer named Karl Emil Doppler, who was tasked with designing costumes for Richard Wagner's 4-opera cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen a Euro, The Ring of the Nibelung a Euro, which premiered in 1876. Wagner's operas drew on Norse mythology and Germanic legend, and Doppler, working without any real archaeological evidence to guide him a euro, because, again, at that point in history, nobody had unearthed one a euro, decided that Viking-esque helmets should have horns and wings on them, because it looked dramatic under stage lighting. It looked powerful. It looked, frankly, awesome. And it worked. It worked so well that the image stuck, spreading through Romantic-era art, then into the 20th century's advertising and pop culture, then into Hollywood, then into cartoons, and finally into the collective imagination of basically everyone who has never taken an archaeology course. By the time actual Viking Age helmets were properly excavated and studied in the 20th century, the horned helmet had already become cultural shorthand. It didn't matter that it was wrong. It looked right. And in the mythology business, looking right often beats being right by a landslide. There's a broader lesson buried in this one myth, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because it's going to come up again and again tonight. Much of what we know about the Vikings doesn't actually come from the Vikings. It comes from people who wrote about them centuries later, a euro, often people who had every reason to make them look as monstrous, savage, or exotic as possible. The horned helmet isn't really a Viking myth. It's a 19th century German opera myth that got attached to the Vikings because it was a good story, and good stories, as we're about to see, have always mattered more to history's popular memory than good evidence. Now, if the Vikings weren't wearing horns into battle, what were they actually wearing? Mostly, iron helmets like the German Boo find when they could afford them a euro, which, it's worth noting, not everyone could. Iron was expensive and labor-intensive to produce in the Viking Age, so a proper helmet was a mark of wealth and status, something a chieftain or a successful raider might own, while a rank-and-file farmer-turned-warrior might go into a fight with nothing but a leather cap, or nothing on his head at all. Shields were round, made of wooden planks with an iron boss in the center to protect the hand, and were probably painted in bold colors a euro, reds, yellows, blacks a euro, based on pigment traces found on surviving fragments, which tells us Viking Age Scandinavia was a far more colorful place, visually, than the muddy brown and gray aesthetic that shows up in most films. And that brings us neatly to the next myth, because if popular culture got the helmet wrong, it got the person wearing it even more wrong. Here's a strange little historical irony for you. The people who called the Vikings filthy were, by modern hygiene standards, considerably filthier than the Vikings themselves. The popular image of the Viking is a grimy one a euro matted hair, months of accumulated grease and dirt, a general air of a man who wrestled a bear and then simply never washed the bear off. It's an image that fits the savage barbarian narrative so neatly that nobody really questions it. But the archaeological and written evidence tells an almost opposite story. Let's start with combs. Archaeologists have recovered an enormous number of combs from Viking Age sites a euro, made of bone, antler, and sometimes even imported ivory a euro, and they show up in graves belonging to men, women, and children alike, across every social class that could afford one, which was most of them. Combs weren't rare, luxury items. They were everyday tools, carried in pouches on belts, used constantly. Some were double-sided, with fine teeth on one edge, specifically designed for removing lice and nits a euro, the Viking Age equivalent of a knit comb you'd find in a modern pharmacy. This wasn't incidental. This was routine personal maintenance, embedded deeply enough in daily life that combs are one of the single most common artifacts found at Viking sites, right alongside more obviously practical items like knives and spindle whorls. Then there's the matter of bathing itself, and this is where the myth really falls apart. Multiple written sources a euro critically, sources written by people who were not Vikings, and had no particular reason to flatter them a euro, describe the Norse as unusually, almost suspiciously clean. The most famous account comes from a 10th century Arab diplomat and writer who traveled north as part of an embassy along the Volga and encountered a group of Rus traders, a Euro, Scandinavian merchants operating along the river trade routes of what's now Russia. He wrote in detail about their customs, and while he found plenty about them shocking and even repulsive by his own cultural standards, he specifically noted that every single morning, a servant girl would bring a basin of water to the group, and each man would wash his face, hands, and hair in it before combing his hair with a communal comb. He described this as a daily ritual, performed consistently by every member of the group, without exception. Now, to be clear, he also describes them washing in a shared basin of water that had already been used by everyone else in turn, which by modern hygiene standards is not exactly ideal, and it's a detail he clearly found off-putting. But the underlying behavior a Euro, a rigorous, non-negotiable daily washing ritual a Euro, is not the behavior of people who never bathed. It's the behavior of a culture with an established, structured hygiene routine, even if that routine doesn't match 21st century standards. There's more. Old English sources a Euro again, written by outsiders, in this case Anglo-Saxons who were frequently on the receiving end of Viking raids and had every incentive to paint their attackers as monstrous a Euro, actually complain about the opposite problem. A 12th century English chronicler wrote that Danish men living in England had become a menace, not because they were dirty, but because they bathed every Saturday, combed their hair regularly, and changed their woolen garments frequently a Euro, and that this excessive grooming made them irresistibly attractive to English women, to the great frustration of English men who apparently could not compete. On the hygiene front, it's a genuinely funny historical detail. The barbarian invaders were, according to their own victims, winning romantically because they smelled better and had nicer hair than the locals. The word Saturday itself is a clue here too. In several Scandinavian languages, the word for Saturday a Euro, lardag in Swedish, la ardag in Norwegian and Danish a Euro, derives from an Old Norse phrase meaning roughly washing day or bathing day. The Vikings didn't just bathe. They had a specific, named weekly day set aside for it, embedded so deeply into their culture that the word survives, essentially unchanged in meaning, in the modern Scandinavian calendar, 13 centuries later. Archaeology backs this up further. Excavations of Viking-age towns like Birka in Sweden and Hedeby in what's now northern Germany have turned up tweezers, ear cleaners, and even little implements believed to have been used for cleaning under the fingernails, often bundled together on a single ring, worn on a belt a Euro, essentially a personal grooming kit that a Viking-age man or woman might carry around with them at all times. Bathhouses have also been identified at Viking sites, structures built specifically for washing, sometimes with evidence of steam bathing practices similar to what we'd now call a sauna a Euro. Hardly a surprise, given that sauna culture in Scandinavia and Finland has genuinely ancient roots. So why does the dirty barbarian image persist? Partly, it's guilt by association a Euro. Later medieval Christian writers, chronicling Viking raids on churches and monasteries, had every reason to paint their attackers as inhuman, godless, and repulsive in every sense, including physically, because it made the violence easier to process and the victims more sympathetic. A dirty pagan savage burning down God's house is a much cleaner moral story than a well-groomed farmer with a weekly bath schedule doing the exact same thing. And partly, it's just Hollywood set design. Mud, soot, and unwashed hair read as authentic and gritty on camera, regardless of what the actual historical record says. The truth is almost the reverse of the myth. If you traveled back in time to the Viking Age and lined up a random Norse farmer next to a random Frankish or English peasant from the same century, there's a reasonable chance the Scandinavian would be better groomed, more frequently bathed, and more likely to be combing lice out of his hair on a regular schedule than his supposedly more civilized neighbor to the south. It's not really a myth about savagery at all, a Euro. It's a myth about who got to write the history books and how they chose to describe the people who scared them. Ask most people what a Viking did for a living, and you'll get one answer: raiding. Sailing up rivers, storming beaches, burning monasteries, taking treasure and slaves and sailing home again. And to be fair, that did happen a euro. The Viking Age is conventionally said to begin in 793 CE, with a raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne off the northeast coast of England, an event so shocking to contemporary Christian writers that one described it as blood from the veins of the saints and compared it to nothing less than the arrival of a plague sent by God as punishment. But raiding was, in economic terms, a side hustle. The vast majority of Norse activity during the Viking Age wasn't raiding at all a euro. It was farming, fishing, craftsmanship, trade, and settlement, on a scale so large and so far-reaching that it's honestly a little staggering how thoroughly the raider image has crowded out everything else in popular memory. Let's talk geography for a second, because the scope of Norse activity is genuinely one of the most underrated stories in medieval history. Norse traders, settlers, and explorers reached, at various points across the Viking Age, Newfoundland in North America to the west, Baghdad in the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate to the southeast, Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, where Norse warriors served as the emperor's elite personal bodyguard, the famous Varangian Guard, and virtually every major river system in what's now Russia and Ukraine, which they used as highways connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. This is, geographically speaking, one of the largest trade and exploration networks of the entire medieval world, rivaling or exceeding the reach of contemporary Islamic, Byzantine, or Chinese trade networks in terms of sheer distance covered, even if not in total volume. The eastward expansion is a particularly undertold part of the story, mostly because Western pop culture tends to focus almost exclusively on the raids into England, Ireland, and France. But Swedish Vikings a euro often called the Russ, a term that eventually gives us the name Russia a euro, pushed east and south along river systems like the Volga and the Dnieper, trading furs, amber, walrus ivory, and enslaved people for silver, silk, and spices. Thousands of Arabic silver coins called dirhams, minted in cities like Baghdad and Samarkand, have been discovered in hoards buried across Scandinavia, particularly on the island of Gotland, which functioned as a major trading hub. Some of these hoards contain literally tens of thousands of individual coins, physical proof of a trade network stretching some 5,000 kilometers from the Swedish coast to the courts of the Abbasid Caliphate. This is also where we get some of our best outside descriptions of Norse life, including the account referenced earlier of Rus traders on the Volga, written by a diplomat who was, by his own account, both fascinated and horrified by what he saw a Euromen he considered physically striking, like palm trees, heavily tattooed, richly armed, traveling in organized trading parties with structured daily rituals, engaged in commerce, not conquest. This wasn't a raiding party. It was a caravan of merchants doing business thousands of kilometers from home. Then there's westward settlement, which is arguably even more significant in the long run than the raids that get all the attention. The Vikings didn't just hit and run England and Ireland a euro, they settled there, in large numbers, over generations. The region of northern and eastern England known as the Danelaw was, for a significant stretch of the 9th and 10th centuries, effectively under Scandinavian legal and cultural control. And its influence didn't vanish when the political boundaries shifted a euro. It's baked into the English language itself. Words like sky, window, knife, husband, egg, law, they, them, and there are all Old Norse loanwords absorbed into English so completely that most native English speakers have no idea they're speaking Viking vocabulary every single day. Even the by ending on English town names a euro, Whitby, Derby, Grimsby a euro, comes directly from the Old Norse word for a farmstead or settlement, by. There are still hundreds of by place names scattered across northern and eastern England today, a literal map of Scandinavian settlement etched permanently into the landscape. Ireland tells a similar story. Dublin, now the capital of the Republic of Ireland, was founded a euro, or at minimum, dramatically expanded and urbanized a euro by Norse settlers in the 9th century, initially as a fortified trading base, later growing into one of the most important slave trading ports in Western Europe, and eventually into a genuine city with its own Norse Gaelic ruling dynasties. Other Irish cities, including Waterford, Wexford, and Limerick, similarly trace their origins to Norse settlement. And then there's the exploration, which is perhaps the single most dramatically underrated Viking achievement in mainstream popular knowledge. Norse settlers reached Iceland in the 9th century and established a functioning, self-governing society there, a euro, one that we'll come back to in detail later, because its legal system deserves its own conversation entirely. From Iceland, in the late 10th century, an explorer traditionally remembered as Erik the Red was exiled for manslaughter and sailed further west, discovering and naming Greenland a euro, a name historians generally agree was a deliberate act of real estate marketing, meant to make a genuinely difficult, ice-covered land sound appealing enough to attract settlers. It worked, more or less. Norse colonies were established in Greenland and persisted for several centuries. And from Greenland, Norse sailors pushed even further west, reaching the coast of North America roughly 500 years before Columbus's more famous voyage. Archaeological excavations at a site called Lance Aux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, uncovered the remains of a genuine Norse settlement, a euro turf-walled buildings in the distinctive Icelandic and Greenlandic style, iron rivets consistent with Norse ship repair, a bronze cloak pin, and a stone spindle whorl used for spinning wool, an item that strongly suggests women were present at the settlement too, not just an all-male raiding party. Radiocarbon and, more recently, tree ring dating using a technique tied to a known solar radiation spike have placed Norse activity at the site to around the year 1021 CE a euro, a remarkably precise date for a medieval settlement, and hard, physical, scientifically dated proof that Europeans reached the shores of North America centuries before Columbus was even born. The sagas a euro, the medieval Icelandic prose narratives that preserve much of what we know about these voyages a euro, describe this land further south as Vinland and recount encounters, sometimes friendly and sometimes violent, with indigenous peoples the sagas call scrawlings. The Norse settlement at Vinland didn't last. By most accounts, conflict with local populations, combined with the sheer distance and difficulty of maintaining a colony that far from home, led the Norse to abandon the attempt after a few years. But the fact that it happened at all a euro, that Norse sailors crossed the North Atlantic in open wooden boats and made contact with the Americas 5 centuries before the Age of Discovery, is conventionally said to have begun a euro, is one of the most genuinely remarkable and genuinely underappreciated facts in all of medieval history. So why does raider dominate the popular image over trader, settler, and explorer, when the historical and economic reality suggests trade and settlement were vastly more central to Norse life? Partly, again, it's a matter of who wrote the surviving records. Monastic chroniclers, the primary literate class in early medieval Western Europe, wrote about the Vikings almost exclusively in the context of attacks on their own monasteries and churches a euro, understandably, since that's what directly affected them and their communities. A Frankish monk writing about the sack of his monastery had zero incentive to also mention that 3 valleys over, a perfectly peaceful Norse merchant was trading amber for wine with the locals. Violence gets written down. Ordinary commerce, mostly, doesn't. And partly, it's just narrative economics. Seafaring raiders in dragon ships is a more thrilling premise for a movie, a video game, or a heavy metal song than seasonally itinerant farmer merchants, who also occasionally participated in coastal raiding as a form of economic diversification. One of those sells tickets. The other one is, unfortunately for Hollywood, closer to the truth. Popular culture, when it bothers to include Viking women at all, tends to fall into one of 2 boxes: the silent wife waiting anxiously at home, or, more recently, the shield maiden warrior fighting alongside the men. The truth is more complicated than either caricature, and honestly more interesting than both of them combined. Let's start with property and legal standing, because this is where the real story lives. In Viking Age Scandinavia, women could own property in their own right. They could inherit land and goods from their families. They could run farms and businesses independently, particularly a euro. And this is important a euro during the long stretches when the men of the household were away raiding, trading, or exploring, which, given the seasonal nature of Norse economic life, could be much of the year. A farm didn't stop needing to function just because its male head of household was 300 kilometers away on a longship. Someone had to manage the livestock, oversee the servants and thralls, handle disputes with neighbors, and keep the household running, and very often, that someone was the wife. Archaeological evidence backs this up in a very literal, physical sense. Keys. Norse women, particularly those who managed a household, were frequently buried with a set of keys, often worn visibly at the waist, symbolizing their authority over the household's stores, chests, and valuables. In Norse society, the key wasn't a decorative accessory, it was a badge of domestic economic control, roughly analogous to being handed the keys to the company safe. A woman who held the keys to a Viking-age farmstead controlled the food supply, the valuables, and effectively the household's day-to-day economy. And that control was significant enough to be marked in death as a defining feature of who she'd been in life. Divorce is another area where Norse law diverges sharply from the popular image of medieval patriarchy. Under Norse custom, women could initiate divorce, and could do so for reasons that included a husband's cruelty, his failure to provide, or even a euro, in one frequently cited detail from Icelandic law a euro, a husband wearing effeminate clothing, which was apparently specific enough to be written into legal custom as valid grounds. If a marriage ended, a woman generally retained her dowry and could return to her birth family with her property intact, rather than being left destitute or trapped, which was a genuinely significant legal protection compared to the marital property laws of many other medieval European societies at the time, where a woman's property typically became her husband's outright upon marriage, with far fewer protections if the marriage dissolved. Now, let's talk about warrior women, because this is the part where popular culture and academic history are currently having their most heated argument, and it's worth laying out the actual state of the evidence rather than just picking a side. The idea of the shield maiden a woman who fights as a warrior alongside men a does appear in Norse